concert.
Yes, party afterwards.
Yeah.
All right, it's 8:30. I'm going to call the meeting, the public safety, what month is this? September? September's public safety meeting to order. I'm going to do a roll call. So, Mr. Buchholz,
Present.
Ms. Dennis,
Here.
Mr. Schluter,
Here.
Mr. Van Etten.
Here.
All right. Madam Clerk, are we in compliance with open meetings laws?
Yes.
The agenda has been presented. Is there any questions on the agenda? Hearing none, moving on to public comment. Is there anybody present or virtual that has, that's not on the agenda that would like to address the committee at this time? Bear with us as we work through the electronic components here. I don't see anybody raising their hands. There's nobody present that wants to address the agenda. All right, moving on. Minutes from the August meeting. Has the committee had a chance to receive a copy of the minutes?
Yes. I make a motion to approve as presented, Mr. Chair.
I have a motion from Mr. Buchholz to approve the minutes as presented. Ms. Dennis?
I'll second it.
I have a second from Ms. Dennis. In discussion, is there any questions on the minutes? Hearing none, call for the vote. All in favor of approving the motion, approving the minutes, indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. All right, next we have a proclamation that that this committee reviewed last month. It's now up again for discussion and possible action. Is there any comment on the proclamation? Do we need it read for the record, or?
I think everybody should have been able to read it, Mr. Chair. I think we need to read it.
If there's no comments, I make a motion to approve.
And so with your motion to approve, what is it that we want to do with this? Send it up to the full county board?
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. I have a motion for Ms. Dennis.
I will second that motion.
I have a second for Mr. Buchholz. In discussion, is there any questions, any comments about the proclamation? Hearing none, call for a vote on the motion. All in favor of forwarding this on to the full county board, indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Proclamation will be going on to the full county board's September meeting.
Add it to me, I'll sign it, Mr. Chair.
All right, next is the judge's report. Your Honor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Schlender. I guess the only thing that I have for this month is an issue that I have had with the Wisconsin state court system. It's my understanding that Dane County employees, so if you work in the court system in Dane County, there is an exemption that you don't have to wear a mask if you have a medical condition. Under the Supreme Court order, Sawyer County is in a position where we have to follow the Supreme Court order. And this is going to sound a little bit complicated here, but one of the things that upsets me the most as a lawyer and as a judge is when one of the main tenets of our law, of our constitutional system of government, is equal application of the law. And I got a little definition here that I forwarded on to them to remind them, and that is to be treated equally by the law and courts, both in procedures and in the substance of the law. So what you have here is a system of a patchwork of all these different orders from the different counties and from the state and from the Supreme Court that basically have different applications of public health orders and things like that. And that what that comes down to is that in the court system, depending on which county you work in, you are in basically being controlled by different orders, and it's very complex and it's very confusing. And they basically have explained to me that the Dane County order did not exempt the courts, and they view the Dane County health mandate as more restrictive than what the Supreme Court is mandating for the court system in the other counties. And so what you have then is that the Dane County health order allows for people to not wear the mask if they have mental health issues or medical issues. And they are viewing that as a more restrictive plan than the Supreme Court order, which mandates on the all the circuit courts, which basically says that there is no provision. You have to wear the mask. The only person that can't wear the mask is the witness on the witness stand, and then I have to make specific findings on that. I know that's kind of very difficult to follow. I had to read through their explanation several different times. I'm just raising the point, not for this committee to do anything about it, but just to be aware that they're in what we've been going through the last 6 months. Once this is all over with, I would really support the at least just the county bringing this issue up to the state and having our local leaders bring this up to the state, that we have to review and come up with a better system here for the future. I mean, because even though that there's this health crisis here, we can't lose one of our basic tenets, and that's equal application of the law. And we all know that a lot of the orders that have been put out have indicated that if you have a medical condition, a legitimate medical condition, there are exemptions to that order. I think Sawyer County's has that. I know the governor's has that. Dane County's has that. But for some reason, the Supreme Court order on the circuit court system is more restrictive, and I think is unfair, and it's not quite right. The reason I'm bringing this up, because I do have an individual that works in my office under the state court system who does have a medical condition. She's got a doctor's note that indicates that she shouldn't have to wear the mask because of a lung condition. And the state court system has told her, well, the Supreme Court order doesn't make any provisions for you to not wear it. So too bad, so sad. But then other state court individuals are able to not wear it. So it's just, to me, an unequal application of the law, and is unfair and is unjust. And so I just wanted to raise that issue. That's not really a local concern at this point, but I do want everybody to be aware that in these crisis times, it is important to review what different entities are doing and to try and make sure that they're acting equally and with an equal application for everybody. So that's my report.
Mr. Schlier.
Thank you. I really appreciate learning this, because I have had a couple of constituents contact me. Well, they're doing this in Green Bay. Why can't we do this here? Now I have an answer.
Yeah.
But I don't understand.
I barely do either.
I'll tell them to call you.
Okay, sounds good. They'll hear a lot of raised voices and frustration out of me, but if they have any questions, they certainly can. So.
Any other questions for the judge? Mr. Bennett, do you got any questions for the judge?
I do not.
All right, thank you. Thank you, sir. Moving on now to the clerk of courts. Oh, Ms. Dennis, go ahead.
I don't have any questions, but I have a comment, and please don't get angry at me. But your mask isn't doing anything.
I don't think any of these masks really are doing
Well,
much.
these do help more than the one you have. Sorry.
Noted.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Moving on now to clerk of court. We have a report by Madam Clerk. The floor is yours, ma'am.
I did submit my report. We were scheduled for a jury trial September 1st, which would have been our first jury trial since the whole COVID thing. It did not go due to a potential possible COVID exposure. So our next date for jury trial is September 11th. It is up with a visiting judge. This causes a lot of issues with space, because we need to take the assembly room, we need to take the UW Extension conference room, and possibly even open up to the back by the judge's office to allow public access. And when we have visiting judges, the issue is we also have Judge Yackel here with his full calendar. Our problem is trying to track all of these rooms. We're trying to reserve them. And then we have to try to remember, oh, the trial's canceled. Now we gotta cancel that reservation. It's just another reason for a second courtroom. I hope you all will take that into consideration because it's gonna bump you guys from this room for your committee meetings. Because we can't stop people from having their jury trials if they demand a trial. I just want to bring that to your attention. And then the rest is, if you have questions on my report.
Any questions on the report? Mr. Bennett, you got any questions for the clerk or clerk report?
I do not, thank you.
All right, moving on to the budget discussion. Mr. Keefe, Mr. Hoff, floor is yours.
Okay, so we're gonna review all of the budgets for all of the applicable departments today.
Are we doing one at a time or are we doing?
Yeah, I think it's on the agenda to do one at a time with each department.
Yeah, we do it individually, then the people that are in those departments that we after.
So I just want to say, these are still preliminary, they're not final, they're still subject to change. Looking specifically at the clerk of courts, did she leave? Okay. Really, all of these budgets we're going to look at, they're budgeting the same for 2021 as we did for 2020. There's really no changes with the exception of one department we'll talk about. We're just trying to kind of get by, absorb the increases in costs as best we can and see how it fits into the big picture and move forward. I don't think there's any staffing changes to the clerk of court's budget for next year. So I don't know, unless you got questions, it's.
Any questions for Mr. Keefe on the proposed budget for the clerk of court? Hearing none, Mr. Bennett, do you have any questions on the budget for this department?
I do not, thank you.
Moving on to district attorney. Mr. District Attorney, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a whole lot that I have to report. We have the full staff at the moment as far as attorneys is concerned. COVID has had some effect on us. We have issues with victims. We have issues with defendants and did I say witnesses or victims first? But we still have issues with all three, victims, witnesses, and defendants. Getting victims access to the courtroom has been a challenge. We've been trying to use Zoom so that they can appear by either video or simply by phone. We've been doing pretty well at that. The judges have been fairly acceptant of that. So I think that has worked pretty good since March. I'm sure we've missed a couple of victims somewhere, but I'm hoping that that's not true. Some folks will come to the courtroom and they'll wear masks and they'll sit 6 feet apart. And so that works well too. I think it's been going fairly well despite the challenges that we've been facing. I don't know if you have questions about my budget. There isn't a whole lot that's changed. It's basically the same. There's a little bit more because, now having 3 attorneys, there's a little bit extra cost for certain things. So we tried to estimate what those would be without going crazy, of course. I asked Mr. O'Keefe, or Mr. Keefe, excuse me, to help with that as well. And I think that it's pretty straightforward.
Any questions for the district attorney?
I just add, there is an increase in a half-time FTE in this budget.
Right. So basically what I'm seeing from the budget is that this is our first time looking at it. So it's kind of like first views.
Yeah, we're still, we've got all the requests from the departments. We're compiling those. We're still meeting with departments. We'll package it all together and see where we're at in total, but individually for the department budgets, this is kind of the first crack at it for committees looking at the requests from the departments.
Okay, so just want to keep that in mind so that, I'm going to ask for questions, but basically this is our baseline information to look at, comparing, maybe contrasting against last year's budget. And then, Mr. Hoff, we have in the past where the board would set up a separate meeting to discuss the budget. Are we gonna do that again this year?
We have nothing scheduled currently other than looking at the public hearing date, and I think we use that date for further discussion amongst the board once that budget is presented to the board and to the public. And I don't think we have a date for the public hearing at this time.
No.
Okay. All right, moving on. Thank you, Mr. District Attorney. We now have, lost my place here, child support. Child support report has been submitted. Is there any questions regarding the child support report? We have a proclamation for the governor.
On the end of her report.
Someone want to explain to me the purpose of the poem?
It does list Sandy and her years of service.
Oh, so it's not our proclamation. This is a proclamation from the governor.
Yeah.
Just acknowledging the Child Support Awareness Month, which was August 2020. So it's for your information and review.
Okay.
For 25 years.
Congratulations.
Right. Well, Mr. Al, please pass the committee's thanks for her service on this locomotive. Right. So we have the draft budget for child support.
Yeah, it's status quo. There's no changes.
Hearing no more questions for child support, we're going to move on to the sheriff's department.
August has been a busy month. We did have quite a few traffic crashes and some that resulted in fatalities. We had a motorcycle traffic crash in July, and we learned in August that the operator of the motorcycle succumbed to his injuries, which put us at 8. And then we had another traffic fatality involving a semi in Loretta in August here. So that bumped us up to 9 traffic fatalities in Sawyer County. We usually average 2 a year. Pat Sanchez and I will be giving a presentation to the full board on the 17th regarding the events that Sawyer County was involved in on the search with 3-year-old Abby in the town of Winter. And we continue to see a rise in drug use, and we are arresting more people for using and dealing as well because of it. And that's all I have. I'll turn it over to the chief and lieutenants.
Dispatch report, the total number of calls for August of 2020 was down considerably from July, like about 700. Of those 5,008 calls, 1,820 were calls for service. So I guess it's a little better than it was in July. Communication centers in the process of training in a new part-time employee, Danielle Church. So the Hayward Schools is also granted dispatch access to their camera system. So in the event of any type of emergency at the school, the dispatch center will have access to the high school's camera system. We did meet with the Fire Association regarding the Spillman module Rip and Run, and I think we've discussed this before. Rip and Run is an add-on feature to our record management system, which will allow us to email call information or through a phone app, get information to emergency services that's needed to a call. The phone app will even plot the call on the map and everything like that, so it's been interesting. So we met with the ambulance the fire association and the sheriff's department, and we agreed as to who would pay the costs of this for the yearly maintenance fee. The yearly maintenance fee is $2,250, so it would be a good application for us. Dispatch relieves or gets a lot of calls after a call from services asking, you know, what their arrival time was and stuff like that. So this would automatically just push all that information via email or a phone app to them. So we'll probably be moving forward with that Rip and Run module and the Active 911, which is the phone app.
Any questions for the chief deputy? Moving on to lieutenant.
You see the patrol reports, and total call reported that we sent deputies to was about 1,159, slightly up from 2019, but it's slightly down from July, where we had 1,178, so I'm hoping that we peaked. A couple other things is Cranberry Fest was canceled. I met with the Cranberry Fest committee. However, we are tasking 2 officers to do roving and mobile patrol in that area, just on the offset that they have an influx of people coming to that area anyway. We're preparing for Trout Fest this weekend, and I've also finalized the 2020-2021 Bureau of Traffic Safety grant for traffic enforcement. We were earmarked for $35,000 again for the coming fiscal year. If we're awarded that, then that'll put obviously federal monies into our coffers for overtime, for traffic enforcement. And my hope is then, as it relates to school bus safety, I'll task officers to handle some of those traffic enforcement issues as well.
Any questions for Lieutenant? Great. All right, Ms. Dennis.
I would just like to say kudos to the sheriff's department for what you're doing with the drug problem here. It's amazing. And I'm sure the rest of us appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I got one question I'd like to throw at him too.
Mr. Buckles.
I would like to thank you guys for your service out there. You guys go out there and do, and your deputies to keep us safe. I really appreciate it.
Means a lot.
Lieutenant.
Well, you can see I have the August jail report up there. I added a year-to-date column for the average daily population, just so the committee can kind of see a running total throughout the year. I will keep that column on there for future meetings. In addition to the report that I submitted, we had our annual jail inspection from the State Department of Corrections this month. That went very well. The inspector was pleased and impressed with everything that she saw. I haven't gotten back the official report from her. She said due to inspection month being very busy in September, it probably won't be until October, but it went very well.
Any questions for our jail lieutenant?
Thanks for the report.
Mr. Bennett, you got any comments for Sheriff's Department?
I do not.
All right, thank you, guys. We have the animal control report. Is there any questions from the committee on that report which was submitted? Other than the fact that we continue to miss Sherry. All right, budget discussion. Everyone has the budget for the Sheriff's Department.
No, can I
We don't?
pass these out? We actually met with the sheriff and chief deputy yesterday to go through and discuss the budget, so I held back putting anything in the packet because I didn't know if something was going to change. So if you don't mind, I'll pass these out.
Sure. You have to get a copy to Mr. Bennett.
Yep. Maybe we can have Carol put it on the internet after the.
We can just scan a copy and email it to him.
You can do that. I don't know, Sheriff, do you want to start with your budget, kind of go through it, or?
Well, and I think the only increase outside of increase in wages and benefits, the only additional thing we requested for the most part, is increased hours for mental health counseling and the medical for the jail with our contracted service. And again, that has not been increased in over 10 years and was structured when our jail population was 60. And last year we averaged 101. We've seen an increase in emergency room visits because the contracted service and what the contract is. I think part of the issue there is they end up having to ship more to the emergency room, which costs us more as well. So I think that may in the end offset some of that, but it's projected speculation too.
So what are we looking at in terms of contrast between last year's budget and this proposed budget?
So if you look at page 13, this pulls in all of the budgets for law enforcement, but on page 13, if you look at the very last number, if you look at the 2020 budget, you see in parentheses, the 5.4 million. That's what the county put towards law enforcement, and this year it's going to almost 5.6 million. So there is an increase in levy needs here for the department. The other area that I think maybe there's an increase that we didn't budget for, I think there's some radios in the budget right now that is an add-on.
Portable radios.
Yeah.
Now, I would just ask the committee to look at this budget and get ready to make sure that we protect this budget as it's been presented, so.
Good. The other thing I will add, just for clarification purposes, in the line items there, when you see the rec officer expense doubled, but we took one of the road deputies out of the road deputy section and moved them to the rec officer position, because we will receive over $20,000 then in revenues from the DNR to support that position. So in the end, it's going to save us 20,000+ by doing that. But by line items, it looks like there's a big increase there, but what it added to the rec officer line item, it took away from the deputy line item.
Dennis?
You were talking about sending them to the emergency room. How do you determine if it's fake? You know what I mean? If it's just a way to get out, or if it's, how do you?
There's a medical protocol that's done if somebody's claiming chest pains or something that would be severe enough that would potentially warrant a doctor visit, and then that decision is ultimately made by the doctor that's with the contracted medical service. They get her on the phone, go through everything in the medical protocol, and then she makes the determination. Unless it's an obvious act of emergency, then staff obviously would send them. But yeah, she ultimately makes that decision on who goes.
You get a lot of them that aren't?
Some, I guess I don't have total numbers in front of me.
No,
but
that's fine.
There's some. I mean, I guess we recently had somebody in from a facility on a writ for court, and he has a history of faking seizures, but we have to cover our lots too,
Right.
So some of it's fake, yes. They get bored, they want to get out for a little bit. Obviously they're in custody when they go, but.
Okay, just curious. Thank you.
And it does tie up road deputy staff as well, because they have to accompany them.
Right.
So.
Any other questions for the sheriff, Mr. Hoff?
Just one more comment. The very last page in the packet I handed out is a summary of the capital requests at this time. Again, subject to change a little bit maybe, but you can see what law enforcement is planning for the next year or two.
Yeah, so again, overall in the sheriff's department, they're one of the larger departments here in Sawyer County. We talked about some of the smaller departments earlier, and, the smaller departments are basically made up of, a person or two and some office supplies, that kind of thing. So their budgets, really don't change year to year, other than, the increase in maybe wages or health insurance or those kinds of things. So those budgets are pretty straightforward, which is why we haven't talked too much about those other departments. They pretty much are what they are. The larger departments get a little bit more complicated, of which, the sheriff's department obviously is one of those, highway is one of those, health and human services is one of those. We spend a lot of money providing services in those areas, and those three departments go through a lot of money, but they also provide a lot of services, and they're all made up uniquely, they're different in different ways. Sheriff's department is made up of, personnel, obviously, the deputies providing the service and what they do. So it's very heavy on the personnel side, as opposed to like the highway department, which is very heavy on construction side. So a lot of their costs are construction, and health and human services is made up of a lot of different areas of services that they do. So it gets very complicated. So as we look at these budgets and try to fit all of the services that we're providing within the levy limits that we're operating under here in the state of Wisconsin, that's where the difficulty comes in, is trying to provide these services within those limits. So we've had several conversations with these larger departments. We met with the sheriff's department again yesterday, just trying to rework some of the things in their budget and look at different funding alternatives, ways we're spending money, just to try and maximize the efficiency of those services that we're providing. So we talk a lot about those other funding opportunities that are out there. We're looking at a deep 911 grant for some other equipment there that might be helpful. So those kinds of things are things that help alleviate the tax levy for the services that they provide. But again, when we try and fit everything in there right now, everything is not fitting in there. So that's what me and Mike work on between now and October, November, is rearranging the services. So when you get the full budget for the full county, there probably will be changes to these budgets as we move forward. And then based on these conversations that we're having in each of the committees, as you get in with the full board and talk about the services that we're providing, then you have the opportunity to make any changes that you see fit to provide the services that you want to provide. So, this is one of the more complicated budgets. Sheriff and the staff have been great to work with in working through these issues. But, we're not there yet, so.
Any other comments? Mr. Bennett, do you got anything you wish to add?
I'm good.
I want to thank you guys. Moving on now to probably the heart of the matter here. Item number 12 is update to existing public health ordinance, discussion and possible action. The committee has chapter 3 of the public health ordinance, and also attached is a resolution to update a resolution for consideration from public safety if there's no other changes. So with that being said, open the floor up for discussion on the public health ordinance. I do want everyone to be aware that Rebecca Roker is available to answer questions. Mr. Hoff.
Yes, thank you. So this is an update to an existing Sawyer County ordinance. This is something that we've talked about the last couple of months as far as this update coming forward. What we were waiting for was the guidance from the WCA. They had a group put together that looked at the issues surrounding public health orders at the local level. And this kind of came about after the state order and the Palm decision and some of those things. So it made us kind of look at what the statutes said about local health orders, and is our ordinance up to date with what happened after that situation. So this group from the WCA, which made up of stakeholders, not only counties, but other interested parties in how these are put together and put forward. And that guidance came out within the last few weeks here, and we looked at that information and tweaked the ordinance reflect some of the things that came out of that guidance. And I will turn it over to Rebecca just to explain what some of those differences are, and then we can open it up for discussion amongst the committee too for questions, comments. But, this is stopping in public safety. It will also be discussed in Health and Human Services Committee meeting. And then if so deemed by those committees, it would move to the full board for further consideration. So at this time, if it's okay with the chair, Rebecca could add some other comments.
Ms. Roker, are you available?
I am.
Floor is yours.
Well, thank you, sir. Tom gave a really good introduction. The reason for the, the timing of you're seeing this ordinance now again was primarily due to the Wisconsin Counties Association's work in this committee, specifically to look at the legal impacts of the legislature v. Palm decision, because that decision was nothing short of revolutionary, if you will, from a legal standpoint, because of the impacts it had not only on the state health department, but obviously more significantly for counties, on the county health departments and county operations in terms of what public health officers can and can't do, or should and shouldn't do under the legal analysis of the Palm decision. So what you have in front of you is an updated ordinance of what you currently have on the books. So right now, it's what the county currently has. It's actually Public Health Chapter 1, which addresses the same topics as this ordinance does. However, this ordinance includes the updates from the Palm decision. So what are those? The most significant is the ability to issue a citation or some sort of penalty for a violation of a public health order. Because currently under the statutes, under 252.25, it was always assumed that public health officers had the authority to issue citations which could carry penalties with them for violations of their health orders. Palm took that statute and really changed the required analysis. And so WCA's underlying position is, in order to enforce an order from the public health officer, you have to have an ordinance in place that clearly states this is a violation and here's what the penalties may be within the discretion of law enforcement and the public health officer, or the public health officer's designee, which in Sawyer County is, one of Julia Lyon's hired staff, who also does enforcement. So what does that look like in terms of the impact on really day-to-day in Sawyer County? So the public health officer still has statutory authority, regardless of what the local ordinances are, to issue some orders. Again, we're talking primarily about enforcement under this ordinance. It's an issue of enforcement. Now, there's some concerns that this ordinance, or even what the statutes permit now, give the public health officer too much discretion. And the public health officer is not an elected official. And so there's concerns that come with a non-elected official, the public health officer, having this broad authority to issue binding orders. So the most significant difference, in my opinion, between this ordinance and your existing ordinance is the requirement that the county board have to approve a public health ordinance that has those broad impacts. Now, there's other counties throughout the state that we're seeing that are trying to pass, I wouldn't even call them similar ordinances, but other public health officer ordinances that give a much broader discretion to the public health officer. So for example, public health officer could issue an order that doesn't require county board approval for less than 30 days. That is significantly different than any order by the public health officer requiring county board approval. So that's really, that county board approval is the most significant difference, again, in my legal opinion, between this ordinance and what you currently have on the books. Other changes, we did just some cleanup in terms of organization of the ordinance, really making sure that the communicable disease section is clearly differentiated from the public health hazard section, because we want to make sure that, or the goal was to make sure under the ordinance that the public health officer still can issue citations for hazardous waste on their property or other public health or public danger activities that, at least for me, I don't think of every day. That's just what the public health officer does on a daily basis. What we're talking about is the communicable disease section. And that is where, these orders that we've seen under the current pandemic have, these broad impacts. That's really the heart of the changes of this that this ordinance sets forth versus what your existing ordinance says. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions, or if you have other questions about WCA's approach or how we memorialized all of these different significant legal impacts in the guidance, I'd be happy to answer any of those questions.
I have a question. We go with Mr. Buckholz. Mr. Betcher, I think you're here to be part of this. You should probably come up to the table.
I'm just here to listen.
Okay.
Rebecca.
Yep.
Doesn't some of this fall under zoning situations as like hazardous waste and any other stuff? And then another question is, when I read chapter 3 and I look at that, doesn't a lot of that falls under what the sheriff and his deputies would handle on their calls? Why would the public health be involved in that, I guess is my question.
Sure, great questions. To tackle your first question in terms of the jurisdiction or the oversight of zoning, you are correct that some of these topics do have an overlay with zoning. So for example, that the conduct on a particular parcel, let's say an industrial use, that would be regulated by an industrial zoning would certainly apply. But if there is a violation of having hazardous materials on that parcel, you'd have the zoning overlay of restrictions on the industrial use, but then you'd also have the public health overlay of what you're doing under your zoning is not only a violation of zoning, but it's also a violation of public health. Now, I don't know how many examples that we can give in the county of situations like that, or how many times public health has had to work with zoning. I can't give you, I don't know the specific numbers, but at least in my experience, I have seen some situations in other counties where those two departments work together. In terms of public health and this ordinance taking over some of zoning jurisdiction, it doesn't do that. At least in my legal opinion, it doesn't. This ordinance does not take away from the powers that the county zoning ordinance has.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
That's good.
And then with respect to your question regarding law enforcement and the sheriff's activities, that's another great question and a very frequent question. What this ordinance does is it allows a public health officer to issue an order and issue penalties for a public health hazard. Now, for the communicable diseases, i.e. this pandemic, the public health officer can issue the order, then county board confirms. Then it becomes a question of who enforces. The public health officer could enforce, or law enforcement could enforce. And in Sawyer County, my personal opinion is you're very lucky that there's a great working relationship between the sheriff and the public health officer. Lots of dialogue, lots of cooperation, and from WCA's perspective, that is the key. To have that ongoing communication, not just, once there is an incident where you'd have, or where there would be a need for law enforcement to come in and enforce a public health order. So in terms of, does the sheriff and his role and his deputy's role play a part in the public health ordinance? Absolutely. But it's a cooperative interplay. And again, that communication between public health and law enforcement is key.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Bennett, do you have any comments regarding this?
Oh, I have many. I got some real questions and many concerns about what we're doing here and why. To start with, the liability of a civilian who's going to be empowered from the county. Why are we doing this? Why don't we supersede and let law enforcement do what law enforcement does, and the county nurse handle this pandemic and whatnot? When we start getting into changing the way things work and have a non-elected individual enforcing and going on private property and doing a lot of stuff, and if she's going to work in conjunction with law enforcement, why isn't law enforcement just doing this? What is the liability of us giving a civilian power to go and do these things? I mean, why wouldn't we already have this set up for law enforcement who has insurance, has statutes, the county ordinances and whatnot? Why are we even going to address having this? I'm just kind of lost why we're doing this. Is the sheriff asking for help, or is he able to handle what it is he handles every day? And now we're getting into something here that I just think this is really a gray area, that are other counties doing this, giving a county nurse power to do things that, that's why we have law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
So there, Rebecca, you got about 14 questions out of that one, so.
I'll do my best. Those are all great questions and great comments, and frequent comments that we field from other counties. The concern, and it's a very good one, how much power are we giving an unelected official, a civilian, this public nurse? And even though the statute set forth requirements of experience and other points of experience that a PHO has to have, still it's not an elected official. And why, that question of why are we giving a non-elected official, really a bureaucrat, all of this power? And a couple of responses to that. Number one, because the statutes allow it. The statutes, even after Palm, give the public health officer authority. The Palm decision does not necessarily impact what the public health officer's authority is. It becomes a question of enforcement. And that's really where the Palm decision has the impact is, okay, public health officer still has this authority, but how do you enforce it? And again, that's why, Mr. Van Etten, your question, why not just let the sheriff do this? That's a great point, because enforcement does generally fall to the sheriff. But we have to ask the question of what is the sheriff enforcing? And that's where we need to have, if the county chooses to have an ordinance or have a public health officer have the ability to enforce the order, even if it's the sheriff doing the enforcing, there has to be something for him to enforce. So what this ordinance does is it puts the public on notice that, hey, if you do not comply with this public health order, then the sheriff may issue you a ticket. Now, if there is, a policy concern regarding giving the public health officer, this essentially law enforcement power, you can restrict in your ordinance the ability to issue citations only to the sheriff and not grant the public health officer that right to issue citations. Again, I think we need to make clear too, we're talking about the communicable diseases, because that's really the heart of the revisions to the ordinance, or the applicability, if you will, of the PHO's power. So in terms of liability, because the statutes grant the county this authority and grant the PHO this authority, the county's liability is limited. Certainly, if law enforcement or the PHO do things that are outside the scope of what they have statutory authority to do, somebody could bring a claim against the county, and then you have the whole analysis of whether there's immunity, governmental immunity, and all of those aspects. But in terms of a general liability question, because the county, the PHO, and law enforcement have the statutory authority as memorialized in an ordinance, then the county's liability is limited.
I have a comment from the sheriff, but before I go to the sheriff, I want to make sure I get the committee members an opportunity to ask any questions before we open up the full discussion. So Sheriff, I'm not cutting you off, I'm just going to put you on hold. Mr. Sleeper, do you have any questions on this? Dennis? So I'm going to give you a shot. Ms. Broker, I got a couple things. Before I do that, I'm going to give the sheriff an opportunity to respond. And then I've got 4 points of contention I have with this ordinance that we'll get into. Sheriff?
I just want to say, when it comes to the enforcement, I think this is an example where, like zoning, there's regulations already, and zoning does their own enforcement. So I think there's examples of where this already happens in the county. Our animal control officer, and there's an example where our agencies work well together. She's obviously not 24/7 like we are. So if we receive a call of an animal issue, we take the report, deal with it initially, and then we turn it over to her, and she does the follow-up. In the case of this ordinance, and this was orchestrated when Eileen was the health officer, and we worked with her as well, and we take the complaint if it's after hours typically or occasionally, and then we will do the follow-up to the best of our ability with documentation, forward that documentation to their office, and then they can do the follow-up. And that also adds a lot of consistency on how it's enforced and how it's dealt with. And I'll give just a quick example. The other day, we had a concern from a member of our community on Round Lake who was very frustrated with a short-term rental next to him. And we had taken quite a few complaints from him in the past, and we got together with Julia's staff. And then there ended up being some probable or possible zoning violations or issues as well. And then her staff gets with zoning, so all the departments work together and have something enforced and dealt with adequately and consistently there. So, and like Rebecca said, I can tell you, I think there's a phenomenal working relationship with all the agencies involved here. And I think it makes things flow much better and is a great advantage to Sawyer County. But we don't have the staff and the time to deal with a lot of this directly in more depth. And this also falls in their expertise. The other issue is, like on these short-term rentals, they do the licensing and all of that. So they have the added leverage from that perspective too. So it's very adequate and better from my perspective if they deal with it directly or on the enforcement side as well.
Thank you, Sheriff. All right, Rebecca, I want you to pull up a copy because we'd love to. This is going to be a lot of lawyer speak, so I hope everyone can bear with. Rebecca, under Chapter 3, first paragraph, we got authority. I got an issue with this idea of the ordinance shall be administered by the Sawyer County Department of Health and Human Services. I don't have a problem with that phrase, but we need to have something in here that says with cooperation from Sawyer County law enforcement or the Sheriff's Department, because that's a separate entity, and there should be some acknowledgement that they're agreeing to either cooperate or have some kind of acknowledgement of what their authority is, because to me it reads that we're co-opting law enforcement under the authority of Health and Human Services. So we got to do something because of the strict scrutiny standard, and the narrowly tailored component of that is we've got the compelling interest because it's a communicable disease, but we have to make sure it's narrowly tailored. And so if we're gonna just blanket authority of Health and Human Services, and then we make mention of county law enforcement, there's gotta be some kind of acknowledgement that law enforcement's either, you know, we have the cooperation. We need to make sure that it's statutorily in place because we may not always have this kind of sheriff or this kind of Health and Human Services. Next one is.
Wait, Mr. Schlender, I'm sorry. What section were you in just now?
Under authority.
Under 1.3?
Not yet, just under authority. That's the first paragraph.
Oh, okay, in the recitals. Got it. Okay.
Next, I want to go down to 1.2. I got a problem with B. So now this has to be narrowly tailored, right? So we have upon the appearance of a communicable disease. Where's the definition of appearance? Who's one that makes that designation? Is there duration, or is there some kind of other declaration, or is this a subjective interpretation by Health and Human Services? Is it the health officer? Because once you do the appearance of, then you're invoking some other definitions here that, to me, is too overly broad. So I think upon the appearance of any communicable disease, there has to be some kind of declaration, some kind of objective manner, so that it doesn't look like Health and Human Services just decided that, you know, we're all afraid of the Minnesota Vikings and that to us is a communicable disease and we're going to, you know, impose some kind of restrictions, you know, ban the color purple, all that stuff. So we go down to 1.C. Now we have the appearance again, and then under 2, we have forbid public gatherings when deemed necessary to control outbreaks, epidemics, and communicable diseases. Forbid to me is a heavy word. And I don't know if that's clearly defined. So forbidden means, are we permanently banning? Are we doing something that somehow, and if we don't have appearance defined, so now we have a subjective interpretation by a department that has now co-opted law enforcement, and now we're going to say that on the appearance of something that may not be openly clearly defined, now we're going to go and forbid people from having gatherings. That's a little bit overly, to me, that's a little bit overly broad and deemed necessary. So I think that there has to be, if we're going to empower this person or this entity or this department with doing something, it has to have a compelling interest. So that compelling interest needs to be clearly defined, and it needs to be narrowly tailored. So it doesn't mean it's open-ended. It has to be a starting point, and there has to be a reasonable expectation of when the ending point is, so that if someone's rights are going to be interfered with, they understand why their rights are being interfered with and the duration of which. We don't want this to be, you know, a 2-year thing. We're 6 months in and we don't have this clearly defined. We just know that we have certain restrictions that we're agreeing to comply with. And so if you want this county board to do something, I think we need to be more specific and a little bit more closer defining what we're trying to accomplish. And then the last one was, well, not the last one, but the next one is isolation and quarantine orders. I think the county gave really good clarification as to what isolation and quarantine means. I think we need to break that, or somehow split that so that we're clear about isolation means infected, quarantine means exposed. And those are 2 different things, and I think they have 2 different standards. So if someone is infected, we definitely want to make sure that that person is, you know, isolated and kind of like, you know, segregated from, you know, causing any more kind of exposure. But if someone is exposed, then we want to make sure that there's a different standard in place so that we have the 14-day quarantine, we got something else in place. If you confuse isolation and quarantine, I think that is going to now create even greater confusion going forward. And then violations is enforceable under subject to any of the following actions. Oh, I know what it was. So we have advisory orders in here, and it says advisory, and it goes to a specific thing saying an advisory order is only for advisory. But then we have in here under the enforcement component, it says that anybody who violates an order under this ordinance is going to be subject to that. And it says any order, and what a judge would have to read that as any order that's issued, and it doesn't distinguish advisory. And so you're making by by that general interpretation, you're making an advisory order. So if someone thinks that they have a discretion under an advisory order, and then the public health officer deems them that they violated their advisory order, you're making them subject to a penalty. And the judge would have to read that as any order. So we need to revise that language so that it either exempts advisory or that we have a different type of order that's going to be subject to some kind of enforcement.
Okay.
Are you with me?
I am. Do you want me to touch on those, Mr. Slender, or?
I think everybody here doesn't want to hear me talk anymore, so.
Okay. Yeah, because there is a lot, and all great questions. Let me start with the advisory orders, because that's kind of the easiest one. I agree. We should clarify that under, what is that? 1.3 sub A. There is some there was intended to be some modifying language that it may only be the violation of orders that are not advisory, but we can definitely clean that up, and I can make that change if you so choose. So that's the easy one. Under the authority, that going back to your first question, we can certainly clean that up as well. Then under 1.2, the appearance, in the use of that word appearance and forbid, you're absolutely right. Those are broad terms, and they do give a lot of discretion. But those are also the terms that are used in the statutes. And so that language is lifted directly from the statute. Now, Palm did not impact those terms of appearance in 25203 or forbid public gatherings, and that's also in 25203. And so that's why there's no definitions included in this draft, because the statutes don't have definitions. And unfortunately, nor does case law. You know, the last time this 252 was touched, I think, was 1981. So this is just unprecedented. And so that's why there's no definition included in this draft of the ordinance. Now, if you want to include a more definitive definition, it's kind of double speak, but a more specific definition, you can do so. However, I would recommend that it be consistent with the statutes. You don't want to deviate from the statutory authority, because then the question becomes whether the county has the power to adopt that ordinance. Again, if it's not consistent with what the statutes say. And again, because these very broad terms of the appearance of a communicable disease that's used in the statute, if you want to further modify or further define that term, we just have to make sure that it's consistent or used consistently within the statutory framework.
So I would say this, and then I'll open it up, because I think we got a couple hands up. One is, as long as they're not less restrictive than the state, we should be able to do something. So if we become technically more restrictive, as long as we stay within the spirit of what the regulation calls for, which is a public health officer having some kind of authority to respond to some kind of disease. Well, we have it too broad right now, because I don't think there was anything in 81, there was nothing similar to what we're dealing with right now. Mm-hmm. And the second is, I am concerned, and we need to put some kind of constraint on this, because it's overly broad so that it's not even going to be enforceable. And then that's another issue just in itself. So, Rebecca, if you got anything else, we'll let you. Ms. Dennis, if you have a hand up. Anybody else have any comments? All right. Rebecca, please continue.
Okay. We as lawyers really struggled with that term forbid public gatherings, because again, it is so incredibly broad, and really all of the language of 25203 is so broad. The words that I seem to now live by is what is reasonable and necessary, because those are the three most important words in the law right now, in my opinion, in terms of what actions are being taken in the pandemic, what is reasonable and necessary. And those where all of the disagreements come between what we're seeing throughout the state is elected officials and public health officers are, what you're doing, public health officer, is not reasonable and necessary. And so for us lawyers to try to hone in on what that is and what that very broad term is, like a public gathering, we just have to look at the particular facts and circumstances. And sometimes that's a good thing as a lawyer, but this one is really hard because, again, we don't have statutory definitions. We don't have case law. So you're right, Mr. Schlender, that however we further define it in the statutes, it just has to be consistent in terms of less restrictive. I agree with you that generally that's the threshold. It should be less restrictive. But even if it's less restrictive, we have to make sure we don't encounter any preemption issues. And again, just so there's no inconsistency between the ordinance and the statute. So those are just my two quick opinions or editorials, if you will, on the broad language of 25203. One trigger that you could utilize in an ordinance is the declaration of an public emergency or a local emergency, and that was done in the county when the pandemic first reared its head, if you will. So, when you're looking to have a trigger point for when the public health officer could issue a really restrictive order, it could be tied to the legislative act of a declaration of public emergency. Keep in mind also that under this draft of the ordinance, if the public health officer were to issue an order, that has to be confirmed by the county board. And again, that's the legislative piece that is not there right now. Let's just use an example. The public health officer thinks that it's reasonable and necessary because a communicable disease has made an appearance and issues an order to forbid public gatherings. Even though that's an order by the public health officer, it still has to be ratified by the county board. And that, again, is an important piece that puts that legislative and elected official overlay on the public health officer's actions. With respect to isolation and quarantine, same thing, with respect to those broad terms of appearance and forbidding public gatherings, there are specific statutes on point. It's 25206, which gives us a little bit more clarification on, what can and can't be done. I was just looking through the statutes to determine whether those are more fully defined. I'd have to go back and look, but what I would say is if that is, if that's what the county would like to do in terms of further clarification of those two terms, you certainly can do so. Just have to make sure from a legal perspective that they're consistent with what the statutes say. And then advisory orders was your last point, and I agree with you that we can certainly clarify that, and it should be clarified. So I think I touched on your questions, Mr. Schlender. If anyone has follow-up questions, again, happy to answer those.
You got anything you wish to add?
Yeah, I got something to add as far as I haven't heard or I haven't read anything about public and then private property. And when we start getting into violating people's rights, and if we have these broad brush painted of what we're going to do and what we're not going to do and what power we're going to give this civilian and what she can and can't do, we have to make sure that we understand that people have the right to do whatever they want within reason on their own private property, and that this cannot violate their rights. It's not going to give a civilian, this is worse than not even a knock and announce. This is going to go up on your property. I don't want to put people in fear that they are going to lose their constitutional rights because a public health nurse can then say, hey, you're gathering in your backyard and this is causing a problem, and so therefore we're going to enforce these kind of things. I just want to make sure that we understand that their private property is completely different.
Mr. Roker? You're muted. You're muted. Which I'm sure everybody wants to mute the lawyers right now, but.
I know, right? I know, I'm sure people wish they had like a button on me they could just mute. Sorry, folks. So, Mr. Van Etten, you're absolutely right. Nothing in the ordinances or in statute can violate one's constitutional rights. That we know for sure, thank goodness, based on the law. With respect to law enforcement or a public health officer entering into private property to break up a family gathering is a huge concern, not only from a constitutional perspective, but also just, from my perspective, a moral issue. If law enforcement is restricted to, a reasonable basis standard, or reasonable suspicion standard, why on earth would we give public health officers more authority than that law enforcement authority? And that is where limiting the public health officer's authority on those public gatherings comes in. So what is a public gathering? Is it 10 or more people? Is it 20 or more people? Those steps in terms of restricting what the county feels comfortable with, from a policy perspective are all important. It also becomes an enforcement issue because even if, the public health officer shows up at a family gathering and tries to break it up, then again, we have an enforcement question of how is that going to happen, or what does that look like? And that's where that communication with law enforcement comes in and is so important. But I don't know if I answered or touched on your specific concern, but you are absolutely right that this ordinance or any ordinance or any statute cannot violate one's constitutional rights. And if it did, I would advise don't do that, don't adopt it, because that does open the county up to liability, and also it's just not legal.
Josh?
No comment.
Ms. Dennis?
No comment.
All right, so is there anybody here who wishes to comment on the proposed statute that we have in front of the committee right now? I make sure that I give you a chance to speak. Awesome. Part about Zoom is that it never works when you need. So, not hearing any more comment. Moving on now. We have a
Wait,
resolution.
Mr. Slender?
Okay.
You don't have your mute button, sorry. Just based on, Mr. Van Etten's comments and just in comments that, we've heard from other counties, what are some options for you? You can limit your definitions in your ordinance, again, to the extent that it's not preempted. You can put specific restrictions on, public gatherings, entering of private property. So just to summarize, you can put restrictions in your ordinance to address these concerns that we've talked about, again, so long as they're not preempted. So I just want, I want to make sure that the county walks away with the message that you can tailor your ordinance to comply with what your policy goals are, again, so long as it's not preempted. And I think a restriction on what a public gathering is would not be inconsistent with the statute. So I think you could do that. That is an option for the county. That's it.
I'm going to close up the comments on this. We have a resolution that's in front of us so I'm assuming, and Mr. Slady can answer this question, Health and Human Services is going to look at this thing.
It's on the agenda, yes. I don't know if we're going to dig into it with quite the intensity that we have here today. Maybe we could see the newly revised version.
So Mr. Hoff, what is it that what's our options here?
As Rebecca was stating, to move this forward, there is a resolution that you can move this to the county board. We did put this on the Health and Human Services agenda as well, because that's where Julia and her staff report to. So it'll get another kick at the cat there. And then, of course, the full board can look at it as well. Now, there is not necessarily any urgency in adopting this immediately. You can still have discussions, make changes, whatever. The only urgency is, as the state order expires at the end of September, if the local health officer needed to do something order-wise in October, November, you may want to have something in place on the enforcement side if that occurs. So that's the only urgency. You certainly can discuss, move it forward, not move it forward. If you don't move it forward, then the health officer does have the ability to make an order without board approval on it. So that's the piece that I think is important to move along, that gives the board the oversight of any order that comes out of the local health officer in the future.
Do we have that oversight now without this chapter, without this iteration?
No, currently under our ordinance and under statutes, the local health officer can make an order, and that is enforceable, or that is an order she can do, and the board doesn't have to approve that under the current ordinance.
Dennis, do you have a hand up?
No, but I'd like to see some revisions in this that have been discussed, but you're saying it's not an emergency, but if something happens in October, this falls back on the original and she can. So what do we do?
Well, I mean, Rebecca can make revisions based on the comments that were here. We can make those revisions and bring that version to Health and Human Services. They could discuss it there. Julia would be present at that, could also add comments and advice. That can move to the full board then, and you can have further discussion and make any other changes or take any action that you wanted to at that point as well.
So we don't need to act on it, then, is what you're saying?
We have the option to not act on it. I personally am not comfortable with this draft in its current form. It's overbroad and it's inviting enforcement into areas by creating a statutory provision or even an ordinance where anybody who stands somewhere else can look at someone else's property and say, I think something is going on there. And then there's a reasonable suspicion for an officer to enter under this ordinance. And then the public health officer can issue a violation, which is, it's a fine, but it would interfere with the conduct that's happening on that parcel. And I just am not comfortable with this. There's no restriction and it's not narrowly tailored. It does not meet that standard that the Supreme Court of the United States has done when you're going to interfere with a constitutional right. And you have a right to gather, you have a right to quiet enjoyment of your property, you have a right to have different gatherings. And if you're going to interfere with that, it has to be a compelling government interest. A compelling interest needs to be narrowly defined so that it's clearly understood by the person whose rights are going to be interfered with, that they understand something's happening. And an appearance of an epidemic, an appearance of no one even seen what this COVID looks like. We have reports over the news, but no one knows what it looks like. So how do we know that it's here? And I'm not trying to say this is the hoax. I think we need to send this back to legal, give them a chance to look at this consistent with the questions that were raised. That's what my position is. Ms. Dennis and then Mr. Schluter.
Okay, I agree with that. Changing it. Let's give both examples to Health and Human Services. They can review it. I hope they get it ahead of time of their meeting. And I hope the full county board gets it so that we don't have to go through this again. I mean, you know what I mean? If they have questions or whatever. If the full county board has questions or they want something changed, they could contact you. You know what I mean? let's let Health and Human Services look at this. Make any recommendations. If they're good with the new one, the changes, forward it on to the full county board for September's meeting. All right.
I wish you had made your last sentence, your first sentence of your last comment there. Because I do agree, send it back to legal. And that would save us some time. You can send it to Health and Human Services if you want. It could be on the agenda. I doubt if it gets more than a cursory reading or attention, because we're not the legal experts. We might as well wait and see what the legals come up with. Take a look at it with the rest of the county board, or hopefully get it prior to the county board meeting.
Yeah, I'll refer to Rebecca whether, those changes that we talked about today could be ready before the Health and Human Services meeting, which is on Tuesday. And I also want to make a comment, this is a very healthy discussion, and this is the way it's supposed to work as far as, this is a policy issue. And so what we're trying to do is address what you want within this policy. So the discussion is good. Rebecca, can you incorporate those ideas into a draft before the Health and Human Services, or what is the timing on that?
Mr. Schlender, may I ask a question?
That's already a question, so go ahead.
I'm going to ask a question statement. Thank you. I have a very good idea of what the committee's goals are. I'm wondering though if I could have an offline discussion just to get some more examples or suggestions on the limiting language for appearance, public gatherings in particular. So for example, public gatherings, are you talking about public gatherings on any private property? And if that's the case, are we talking about restaurants? Are we talking about just homes?
I think we know where this is going, and this is consistent with what Ms. Dennis, Mr. Schliger said. I'll entertain a motion from the committee to send this back to Court Counsel for revisions, and then Mr. Hoff and I can discuss with Ms. Roker what those revisions would look like, and then we can make a determination. If that
Very
is,
good.
and then Mr. Schliger, you can decide if you want that to be on the agenda for next week.
Very good.
Send chapter 3 public health ordinance back to legal for update, whatever.
So I have a motion and a second. In discussion. Any discussion on the motion?
I would like to say, I would not have a problem making a county ordinance that is directed to the sheriff. I have no problem with that. My problem is that we're doing this with a civilian, whether they work hand in hand, doesn't matter. This is a law enforcement matter. We should be doing a county ordinance then to help the sheriff out, to give him guidance for what he's doing, not a nurse.
And we asked Rebecca, is that this motion, is that within her understanding of what? Okay.
Rebecca, do you understand what the motion is on the floor?
I do. I just want to make sure that the committee understands that I would really appreciate more direction, in terms of honing down on the specifics. And I understand that we can do that offline, Mr. Schlender, between myself, you, and Mr. Hoff. But in order to really get at the heart of what the committee's intent is, I believe, we need to have some good, healthy conversations in terms of what it is you want to hone in on from a policy perspective, so I can properly memorialize those in your ordinance.
What I would offer for is more specific instructions. Is you've got some questions and concerns. You've got Mr. Bennett's public and property and sheriff's involvement.
Yep.
you've noted my questions, which were language specific. You've got some of the concerns that were raised from Ms. Dennis and Mr. Buckholz in terms of the zoning and the jurisdictional component.
Yep.
If you want to look at those and put together a draft, I don't know what you will have ready for Mr. Streeter before his committee. So I would defer to him and Mr. Hoff in terms of any other committee looking at that, and then just giving you some time, more than a weekend, to try to put up some kind of revision, because this is not time sensitive in terms of getting this passed, right?
Right. Please, Mr. Van Etten, if you would like to email me directly, please do so. Sheriff, of course, please email me directly. So then, you know, I have all of that in front of me. And of course, you know, I'll have those discussions with Mr. Schlender and Mr. Hoff too. Timing is not an issue if I have some more specific direction in order to draft to get you that draft before. Well, it'd have to be posted Monday evening. I just need that more clarification.
I'm trying to save your weekend. Ms. Dennis.
No
Is
worries.
it possible for the board chair, Mr. Schlender, Tom, the chairman, which I think is Steve, Health and Human Services, or is it Dale? Could they meet, have a special meeting with the attorney? That way everyone is involved that can present that. I really don't want one board member representing, you know what I'm saying? What do you think?
That can happen as long as it's not a forum mode.
If you have a special meeting.
Well, a special meeting, yes.
That's what I said.
Okay.
I mean,
I
we
thought
had
you were talking
special
off.
meetings
That's
for
it's up
things.
to our board chair and vice chair to make that kind of determination. So, any other discussion on the motion to send this back to legal? Hearing none, I'm gonna call for a vote. All in favor of this motion indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Okay, moving on now to the coroner's report. Coroner. The coroner's budget, it's a your first view. So
Yeah, pretty much
just
status quo.
moving on to emergency management. Ms. Sanchez, are you still with us?
I am still with you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. You have my report in front of you. Any questions on it?
Any questions for Ms. Sanchez on her submitted report? Any questions for Ms. Sanchez regarding John Crook's report? Going to the discussion for her budget.
Pat, you want to touch on your budget?
Just that it is decreased a little bit. I gotta pull it up here for a minute. Hold on. I lost it again. Still trying to get used to all this technology. So it is decreased somewhat. We are also looking at a change in, I don't know if you want me to bring this up, where the communication part goes. Is that what you're talking about, Mike?
Sure.
Yeah, so we're actually looking at, we have the contract position with John Crook. We're actually looking at moving that under the Sheriff's Department. So that would decrease my budget by the contracted amount. We also did decrease in certain areas where, trying to pull this up where I can see it better, and repair and everything else. So, I mean, I am decreasing my budget the best I can. The biggest noted thing would be my projected budget from 2020 to 2021 is the decrease in life or health insurance. So pretty much it's the same.
Any questions or comments for Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, thank you for your report.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Moving on to the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council update. We met. What day did we meet? The 19th of August. At that meeting, we appointed two citizens to serve on the committee as noted in the bylaws. Kathy McCoy submitted a letter of interest and she was appointed. Gary Hilgendorf submitted an email and letter of interest and he too was appointed. And so we're now a full complement. We met with Justice Point. We made a motion to accept the proposal, which I think is going to go in front of the full board. And that's the update we have from the council. We're going to meet again on the 15th of September. You have the budget, which is in front of you. There's some maneuverings that are happening, but Mr. Pugh.
Yeah, my only comment is the budget, the way it's set up right now, does not reflect the changeover to Justice Point. So when that becomes ratified, if it does, we'll switch the budget over to that.
Right. So essentially, what the budget has is, I think it's based on last year's projection, and because Ms. McDaniel retired, and we lost Deputy Welch, who was who was responsible for some of the programming. I think we're going to be using some salary savings from that position to help pay for what is Justice Point's provision, and they're going to hire someone from the county locally. They're going to
hire local individuals, yes, to perform under the direction of Justice.
Okay, and then so Sheriff's offering some of his budget to pay for that, or at least whatever that salary allocation is. Okay. Any questions on that? It's going to get complicated. We'll probably have a better idea probably after this next month. Hearing none, moving on. Ambulance department, item number 12.
All right, so of course, COVID is now our status quo. After this morning's meeting, at 7:45, we heard we have about 17 individuals that are positive for COVID in the county currently. That's our number. With that, we are transporting COVID patients or suspected COVID patients. We had one incident involving a non-suspected COVID patient that ended up being COVID, which put 3 of our crew members plus the Lifelink helicopter on quarantine for 14 days. That quarantine was done after Saturday, this Saturday. We did, of course, standby at the Sawyer County Fair. Nothing too eventful there. With COVID, I will say, and we all kind of know it, things are just getting very hard to obtain, even from our normal suppliers. I was notified yesterday that we are allotted for a whole month 19 boxes of gloves from our main supplier. That's just exam gloves. So just so you know, we do have enough, but it's starting to get kind of hairy even on the easy stuff. The other big thing is that we were notified late last month that our billing company, our main person that owns that, it's owned by one person, Bill Schromer, is sold it to another private individual. And from what I understand from the email, it's like going to be a 3-month transition. We haven't heard anything from him yet. They're supposed to set up dates and times. So just giving that out to you. And then call volume lines, we are still up. And I don't foresee that changing go down. So.
Any questions for Mr. Nate? Thank you for your report, sir. Budget, again, this is the baseline information. Any questions for Mr. Keefe on the budget? Hearing none.
What
Committee
happened,
member?
what happened to the EMS services neighboring community discussion in Fox Black?
I'm gonna hand out, we sat down and went through this a little bit yesterday.
What are we getting?
Just some options, consideration on how we're going to assess Washburn County townships that ambulance provides services to.
We're going to need to get a copy of this to Mr. Bennett.
Basically, I'll just give the introduction and then Mike and Nate can chime in as well. The issue is the services provided to entities outside of Sawyer County, those townships, in Washburn counties that we serviced here in the past. And, the methodology that we use as far as billing for those services. Just backing up a little bit, the county has a countywide ambulance service. And that ambulance service has a budget. It's a little bit more than $1 million, and that gets allocated to those entities or those towns in Sawyer County as a tax. It's a property tax kind of thing. It's outside of the levy limits, but it's still a property tax based on values of the taxing entities. So, and that's by statute what we have to do. So townships get allocated based on equalized value for the value in that township. So that, again, is a statute that we comply with as far as allocating those costs. When we're talking about entities outside of the county, we don't tax anything outside the county. It's more of a user fee scenario than a tax. And so the methodology that we have employed and others in similar countywide ambulance situations have employed is kind of basing it more on a population kind of calculation. So if you look at the population of the county and those townships and do an allocation based on that, then it's a methodology of equally allocating based on population. So that's kind of the methodology that we started way back when, but actually the current payment is not in line with the per diem or the calculation of population. If we did the full extent of that, there's an argument to be made on whether to charge the full amount or not. I mean, basically, our fixed costs are covered by Sawyer County. If we didn't do anything outside of the county, we would still have those fixed costs and they would still get paid for it. So do we charge the full extent to Washburn County residents? Do we charge the variable costs? Do we charge on a different method? Those are kind of the questions that are kind of out there, but we've laid in front of you, and I'll let Mike and Nate kind of explain it a little bit further. But the current payment versus per diem amount to get up to that full per diem, if in fact that's the direction we're going. So,
Nate, you want to touch on this first?
Oh, you? I see how you do it.
All right. So under the current payment column shaded for each of the townships, that's currently what we're assessing them annually. And we've actually, I think it's probably 3 years in a row now. And so we're looking at, should we update the numbers under different scenarios? So we put together 3 different options here. We picked the $29 per diem option, which is close to what we've heard another ambulance company is looking to increase their rates in Washburn County. They're a basic service ambulance. We're an advanced life service, so we've inflated our numbers a little bit to reflect that. In the $29 option, we have a $40 option, per diem option, which is about double of what they're currently paying to each of those entities, with the exception of Birchwood. And then there's about a $70 option, which is close to what our net cost is, what our levy is divided by the population of all the entities involved.
Who's going to pay for this?
Well, we're looking at what amount are we going to assess to the town of Bass Lake, Birchwood, and Stone Lake. These are all Washburn County townships. The question is been raised, what are you charging them? Are we charging them enough? Are we charging them consistently with what we're doing in Sawyer County or not? So like Tom mentioned, in Sawyer County, it's a tax, but we can't tax entities in another county. So it's set up more as a user fee. So we're trying to define that, what's reasonable. I guess, and this is just for discussion. This is not final subject to change for a few different reasons. One being, we're not totally set on the ambulance budget yet. So the ambulance levy amount could change, which would change these numbers. Not significantly, but it can change them. But in my opinion, if we're going to pick some other alternative, maybe we should step ladder there over a year or two instead of going from, you're paying $10,000 a year. Now we're asking you to pay $35,000 a year. That's quite an increase to the townships. Plus, it's probably getting a little bit late because if we go to them and say that, they might want to look at alternatives, and it doesn't give them a lot of time to consider other alternatives. So just my recommendation, maybe don't jump to a $70 per diem option.
I thought at one meeting, and I hope it wasn't 3 years ago, but I thought that we did increase.
I think this is.
We discussed it.
It's come up before, but nothing has changed.
We were talking about it last year, but we
Yeah.
missed the time frame because they had already set their budgets. So then we told them when we sent out the payment requests, and we called them and we said, hey, next year we are going to look at increasing. And they understood.
Okay.
But we just didn't give them a money amount. My personal opinion is if I'm a taxpayer in this county, I would expect that they would pay close to what I pay for services. But then that also raises the question of, do they drop us, ethical, moral? That's just me. So
I like the idea of not increasing it to the last from the 35,000, but increase every year so much. I mean, it costs a lot of money to go on the ambulance. It does.
Yeah, it does. One thing that could happen, I don't know if it would or not, but we raise it, one of these townships say, no, we're going to go elsewhere. Now we're out of that revenue, but you may still end up serving that territory. Now we're getting nothing. And maybe you want to explain that.
So Town of Stinnett, from what I understand, Town of Stinnett said no originally to these amounts when Eric was still president. It seems as though we primarily still cover Town of Stinnett, but they do not pay. They pay another contracting service as their primary service, which would be North Memorial. I'm just saying, it seems like it because I haven't been able to call Washburn County yet to see what numbers, are they actually going and paging North Memorial first before they page us. Under mutual aid, as we know, there's 3 different ways. Under mutual aid, it is, hey, they already have a certified truck out, they don't have anybody to cover. Of course, we cover because they would do the same thing to us. If they don't have a truck out and they're going, hey, page Sawyer County, then that would be a backup agreement. And we do not have one of those currently with North Memorial. So I need a little history on that from their dispatch center, because our dispatch center doesn't know if they're just saying, hey, page Sawyer County, or just page Sawyer County. They don't take that call. But like I said, it is sticker shock. It's going to be a huge sticker shock, especially if it's not stepped. But I also, I don't want to go, well, why are we paying this amount and then they get the less either? So
I got one question. On this $29 per diem, Nate and Mike, you said the one ambulance that covers them is not advanced life support like Sawyer County. So I think just within that fact alone would be a little more because of your word advanced life support.
Yes. So in previous years, the net has asked, would you give us, because I think they renew or they look at it every year, they have asked, what would we charge? And I know one year we said, well, we can't give you a BLS rate.
We cannot do that. We're not even gonna be comparable to you. Now, from what I understand is North is relooking at all of their areas and going to raise and increase from what they are currently paying. And it sounds like it's about $28 is where they're kind of looking at. I can't say that for sure, but that's what we've heard. So we just went with 29, you know. But again, you know, we can't, you know, our crews send, you know, a paramedic and the 2 EMTs. We're not comfortable because we do not know if this is a Stinnett address. They'll pull up on that fire number and go, oh, this is Stinnett, sorry, we're gonna turn around. So that's where we have some conflict with the crews too, and with that.
Well, I'm getting sticker shock knowing that we're paying for Stinnett and collecting not a damn dime. That was never supposed to be. Why are we just hearing about this now? I had no idea that was going on. What is the per diem right now for taxpayers in Sawyer County to support the ambulance?
You want to know?
Well, if you look at it on a per diem for the county as an entity, that's the 6892. You know,
Which is, where is it?
That's in the first column at the bottom, cost per citizen. You know, if you take it, the total cost of the ambulance divided by the total cost of all served, you know, that's the $68.92, which is a high number, but keep in mind too that, you know, we're serving probably double that number on a per person basis because we have a lot of second homes and whatnot. But, you know, if you just take the population as it is, that's the number that we have. So, you know, in theory, that's the per diem idea was the way, you know, this was set up for those Washburn County townships. We haven't kept up with it for a couple of reasons, but you know, that's the methodology that we are employing or should be employing. And to get there might take a couple of steps if that's the direction we're going.
I've got a real problem with it. We're charging Sawyer County residents $68.92 and we're going to give it to them for $29.
Well,
Now, I don't, if that gets out, we're going to have a bunch of irritated Sawyer County residents.
Well, that's not an accurate statement. This is being allocated to Sawyer County residents is based on equalized valuation, not population. This is showing population for calculation purposes to show a fee scenario, not a tax scenario. We can tax Sawyer County residents, but we cannot tax Washburn County, so we have to establish a fee.
So
this is establishing a fee based on population.
Okay, but the $68.92 is based on assessed evaluation and not.
No, that's based on population. That's a fee. That's a fee scenario, which is different than what we're doing in Sawyer County.
No, you said $68.92. I asked you specifically, what does a per diem cost in Sawyer County? You referred me to the $68.92 number.
That's correct. As far as if you took the total dollars divided by the total population, that's $68.92. But in you know, the townships within Sawyer County don't get a charge of $68.92. They get charged based on valuation, but if the valuation totals the same thing as if you did it per diem in total. Townships pay it differently because of equalized value in this township. But in total, yes.
That makes sense, but this is the per diem cost to Sawyer County residents.
That is correct.
So let me just give you an example. I'm going to choose the town of Radisson. So if we look at their equalized value, it's around 65 million. We look at town of Bass Lake, on here it's about 71 million. So they're somewhat comparable. When we allocate the tax to the different townships based on equalized value, Radisson's allocation was $22,000. Not 35,000 that you're seeing here based on a population calculation.
Okay.
So it's not as high as you think it is. to the taxpayers
Uh,
in Sawyer.
But that's because of a different methodology of distributing the costs of the county.
Correct.
But the fact is, as you take the total ambulance cost, divided by the total population, the number is 6892.
That is correct. And that's the theory or the number this last column is showing as a calculation to the Washburn County townships.
Well, I still believe it's going to be very difficult to explain to Sawyer County taxpayers that per diem, they're paying $68.92 and we're only charging Washburn County townships $29 per diem.
And that's
It's going to
that
be
is
a real problem. And you said $1 million budget for the ambulance. What is their offset revenue?
well, their budgeted fees is somewhere around 1.4 million. If that's what you're asking.
Yeah. So is the ambulance paying for itself?
No,
How much?
because we put a little over $1 million of levy into the ambulance to subsidize it.
Yeah, that's okay. That's the number I wanted. We put in $1 million.
Yes, overall.
Okay. So when we first started talking about, and this is several years back, about providing service to the 4 Washburn County townships, it was supposed to be cheaper by the dozen thing. If we had more residents, more individuals, people using our ambulance, we could spread the cost out further and come closer to offsetting all of the costs and lowering the costs per diem for everybody. This sounds like we never did do that, which really disappoints me because I am positive that that was the original intent of the committee and the county board.
I mean, the only thing I can say is, one, like we said, it hasn't been kept up the last 3 years.
And well, that doesn't make me feel good either.
But the other thing I will say is the ambulance department was set up differently when this started versus what it is now. You know, it used to be a volunteer service. Volunteer service. We're an employee service, so the costs have gone up significantly. And because of that, the county is going to have to subsidize more and is subsidizing.
We've been raising our rates, consumer
year ago.
Costs.
Yes, yeah, we've raised them, and that's why I brought it last year. What we were paying, we haven't done it at all this year. We haven't reviewed what they are either for this year, for this current year.
Why not?
We just haven't yet.
Well, you're going to before you finish your budget request.
I think we normally do that. Yeah, I just don't know when we normally do it.
Well, we do the revenues as the whole revenues or fee structure throughout the county. So there's a book that we have that has all the fees in it, including the ambulance service. The trouble with raising ambulance fees, you don't get that on the majority of runs because you only get the Medicare rate on those runs. So we can raise the rates. It doesn't have a real significant impact on revenues, but we do try. I mean, we compare to other entities as well in the area and take a look at that. So that's the timing of when that happens. With regard to your question, Mr. Sleeter, you're absolutely right. I mean, the theory behind this is what was originally contemplated, and through the changes throughout the years, it really hasn't been calculated the way that it should have been, perhaps in previous years, which is why we're talking about it now to see the other part of it, not just the finance part of it, but the moral part of it. Are you still going to notice the net whether they pay or not? As Nate said, sometimes you don't know you're into the net until you get there. So we've been providing service when you get paged out to those entities. But to your point, they should be paying their fair share just like everyone else.
At least.
And don't lose sight, this is just a fee for being the primary provider for that area. When they go to a particular person's home, they're still, charging their fees to that patient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get.
I'm just saying, it's not, this isn't the only revenue we get when they
Of
go.
course not, it's not the revenue you get in Sawyer County either. Because the people out there
Correct.
who have insurance are paying, providing the same deal, same difference.
Right.
It doesn't change anything that I'm talking about. And I understand that we can raise our rates because of that, but because of Medicare, it doesn't help significantly, but it helps a little bit, and we're scrabbling for nickels and dimes. We should be raising our rates a little bit every year, commensurate with our costs. And you're right, we have a higher population than our census says because we have so many second homes. But we're also blessed by the fact that people with second homes usually have health insurance or Medicare, blah, blah, blah packages that pay better, and they pay their, they have the insurance so they can afford to pay. And that helps support the ambulance too. But do we have any idea what it cost our ambulance department to serve the town of Birchwood last year? Or to serve the town of Stone Lake, Washburn County, Stone Lake? Do we know what it cost, how many runs we made, what that?
I'm still trying to get that. Like I said, this is early. We're just trying to get the numbers from Washburn County Dispatch.
And I'm just trying to explain to you what information I want, because I want to get back on track to where the ambulance was heading, proposed or expected to be heading a few years ago. And I understand completely that it was a mess, and there was a lot of pushback from the people over there because they were very reluctant to change. And we went through several directors, and it's been a nightmare, but it's got to stop. We've got to figure this out and make it somehow everybody pays an equal share. I'm done.
Anything else on this topic? Okay, I'm sure this is going to come back on the next month's agenda. Any other future agenda items for this committee to consider? Have you got anything? Take that as a maybe. All right, anything for discussion only? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned. Chuck. Go ahead, Chuck.
The only thing I got to say is I'm in these meetings, unfortunately, we got a Zoom or whatever, but your meeting is always outstanding. I have issues with the other meetings, even when I'm on the full county board. You can't get recognition. You can't get anything in. You can't talk to anybody. And we need to address this, because if this is our future, how we're going to do things, there's got to be a better way. And my hat's off to you, because you engage with everybody on there and take the time. Everybody else needs to do the same.
Meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everybody.